2017 Puebla earthquake. My name's Irvin Flores.
Amelia Green.
I'm Cassandra Soto.
Type of disaster and location. This natural disaster was in fact a geophysical disaster due to the fact that the earthquake occurred as a result of faulting. Its epicenter was located in San Felipe Ayula, a town in Isa- Izúcar de Matamoros, Puebla. It was 34 miles southwest of the city of Puebla and 75 miles southeast of Mexico City. These two areas were the most affected, but other states like Oaxaca, Morelos, Guerrero, and Estado de Mexico suffered as well. Although these states were somewhat far from the epicenter, they were still greatly affected and experienced deaths, injuries, and economic losses. What happened on September 19th, 2017 was that at 1:14 local time, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake hit, shaking the energy lasted about 20 seconds. The government of Mexico declared an emergency for areas of Mexico City and parts of Guerrero, Morelos, and Puebla states.
There was an estimated direct economic loss of between 4 billion and 5 billion. The majority of the damage occurred in Mexico City, Mexico State, and the states of Puebla and Morelos because they are regions with high population density and industrial infrastructure. Over 190,000 properties, including homes, schools, public and cultural infrastructure, were damaged. Approximately 4 million children had to be relocated from their usual schools due to structural damage, and as many as 4.6 million buildings lost electricity, including 40% of the homes in Mexico City. The gas main parts of Mexico City and other towns also ruptured, which sparked fires. The worst affected sector was housing, specifically in the states of Morelos and Puebla. Vulnerable structures like unreinforced buildings and many old cultural buildings like churches or convents suffered severe structural damage. It is said between 10,000 and 20,000 houses were destroyed and almost 100 buildings fully collapsed. Almost 95% of the buildings that collapsed or were severely damaged were constructed prior to 1985. New buildings that were built later than 1987 withstood the earthquake far better than the other structures. An estimated cost to repair and rebuild homes was 550 million. Damage to cultural sites was said to reach 440 million, and repairing and rebuilding schools in several states and the capital had a near estimate of 750 million. Beyond the losses caused by the earthquake's destructive force, less direct consequences also impacted the economy. One was the inability of people displaced by the disaster to continue their work. Restaurant owner of Copa Papa, Antonio Luna, had to let go of 3 dozen employees, which was bad for both sides because the workers were out of jobs due to expenses and the owner's business was slowly falling. He tried to salvage what was left of his restaurant and save equipment that was yet to be damaged. He ended up having to let go of everyone because he couldn't afford to pay his employees. Many helped in assisting Mexico by donating monies to help rebuild schools and infrastructure that was damaged and gifting housing grants.
Why did it happen? Uh, as previously mentioned, it was caused by normal faulting. The focus of the earthquake was 32 miles underneath the surface. What happened was that the oceanic crust on the cocoa plate subducted under the continental crust on the North American plate. This caused at the contact point to create downward bending, which created uplift and started to create shear stress on the North American plate. Eventually, there was too much stress for the North American plate, so it ended up releasing tons amount of energy.
Sorry. Many sadly passed away that day, with the most being in Mexico City with 228 people, 74 in Morelos, 45 in Puebla, 13 in Estado de Mexico, 6 in Guerrero, and 4 in Oaxaca. There was a total of 370 deaths with over 6,000 people injured. People were either treated at hospitals or if they were able to be taken or they were taken care of near the site where they were injured. More than 20 children and 2 adults were found dead at a school in the neighborhood of Coapa. 5 people were killed and some 40 injured at the Monterrey and Technological Campus in Mexico City. Many bodies were discovered in the middle of collapsed buildings and the death toll continued rising. Most deaths resulted from being in housing structures, schools, or work buildings. Soldiers were deployed to help search the rubble of collapsed buildings for survivors, and thousands of rescuers and civilians were working side by side to dig through tall piles of remains from dozens of crumbled buildings, searching for days. Some carried away buckets full of debris, while others called out the names of those who have yet to be rescued. At times, rescuers asked for total silence as they tried to hear voices coming from under the debris. They had posters put up that said silencio on them, which means quiet, so that they could hear if any survivors called out. They searched for days until there were no more missing people. The massive shockwaves of this earthquake destroyed dozens of buildings, including schools, apartments, and businesses areas that resulted in many deaths.
Okay, now the impact on human history and what has been learned from the earthquake. One of the major impacts on human history is the loss or damage to cultural artifacts, such as churches. Some towns, which were famous for churches, now have to either rebuild or just repair them as they are. Of the newer buildings that were destroyed, many people made complaints that the structures were not in line with building codes before the disaster occurred. In 2016 alone, Mexico City residents lodged over 1,000 complaints about violations of zoning or land use ordinances with the Environmental and Zoning Prosecutor's Office, but little was done to address the complaints or bring the buildings up to code. An example of this is when an elementary school collapsed during the earthquake. These photos show the rescuers looking for trapped children after the earthquake had occurred. There was an investigation into this, and they found out that the owner of the private elementary school had broken building codes to construct the elementary school. She decided to build an apartment on top of the school, even though it made the structure unsafe. This decision killed 26 people, including 19 students, during the earthquake. Because of the investigation, she was sentenced to 31 years for manslaughter and had to pay fines to the city and to the survivors' families, or the families of those who died. This showed the corruption of the political system, ending in unnecessary deaths because the building codes were not enforced, and caused people to die as a result. In addition, the earthquake occurred on the anniversary of the devastating 1985 earthquake, which ushered in new building codes that were stricter. The past earthquake brought but currently it seems, even though those building codes were updated after that earthquake, it seems like the lessons that should have been learned were not or could not have been learned after the 1985 earthquake. Some of the reasons for the fact of this disaster occurring being worse than it could have been is because during 2000 to 2015, housing stock grew, and capitalized on this, safety was often set aside for profit and speed for building new buildings. The city was originally built on a lake, so the soil is soft and can worsen the effect of the earthquake. So the effects of failing to follow building codes can be magnified and more costly because of the environment in which the earthquake occurred. In conclusion, the short-term economic incentives and corruption led to more deaths and injury than necessary because building codes were not upheld to the caliber they should have been. On a more positive note, Cassandra.
Lots of organizations came forward to aid the people in Mexico. The Mexican Red Cross teams led emergency response and relief efforts by searching for survivors, transporting the injured to hospitals, and providing immediate first aid in the hardest hit areas. They deployed doctors and nurses, search and rescue specialists, and ambulances, as well as more than 31,000 volunteers. Global Giving and the International Community Foundation are both nonprofit organizations that set up relief funds to provide immediate relief to survivors in the form of food, shelter, water, and medicine. They helped refund the rehabilitation of small businesses, training for economic development, and the reconstruction of homes and buildings. The government of Mexico also accepted the U.S. government's offer of assistance. UCSB deployed a DART composed of disaster specialists and USAR urban search and rescue personnel team from the Los Angeles County Fire Department to support the emergency response. In the U.S. also sent several planes of food, water, and relief supplies. Many grants were given, such as the Cultural Preservation Grant. The U.S. government awarded $200,000 in funds to the National Institute of Anthropology and History to recover and stabilize the structural integrity and security of the ex-convent of St. Martin of Tours in Puebla. Social help between everyone showed through the process. Small restaurants sat tables on the streets to feed volunteers and victims for free. Taxis gave free rides to transport victims to hospitals and volunteers to needed points. Nurses, doctors, and veterinarians were helping victims at no cost, and Telcel, which is a big telecommunication company in Mexico, opened all their networks to the public for free for the following 3 days after the earthquake. Internationally, without being asked, the Japan International Cooperation Agency also sent a disaster relief team, and the Turkish states sent humanitarian aid. The collective teamwork of everyone from the international community and Mexico aided the people, helping them recover and respond to this disaster as a whole team.